Yes, we are live with Victoria Lynn Garvey.
Oh, and here comes, Pat.
Come on in, Pat. I can get Pat this seat. I'll sit on the floor. Pat, would you like this seat? I can sit on the floor. Sorry, Facebook Live, folks. We're settling in. Oh, you can sit right there. There we go.
Did you come from work?
Vicki, it's live. Would you like to say anything while we're waiting?
Well, the handout, as you see, begins with definitions from the dictionary. I have always liked to read dictionaries. Me too. And when we're doing something like a specific semantic field around a word, I want to know, even though I know the meaning of the word, I want to know as much as I can. One of the interesting things was what I found out, not so much on Merriam-Webster, but the online etymological dictionary, which I love. Not only did it give me the root of the word sex, sexuality, etc., it also gave me this interesting information about how the word grows a little bit, with something happening in the 18th century, the 19th century, and the 20th century. And there's actually even more than that, but it gives you some sense of how things have grown. When we get to the section on homosexuality, I think a lot of people don't know that we didn't even have the word until the 19th century. The Oxford English Dictionary doesn't list it until its second edition in 18-something. It's in here. Which makes it really interesting when you think that people think homosexuality, as we understand it, has been condemned for 4,000 years, at least in the biblical tradition, and that the reviews are really mixed, but they couldn't have been referring to homosexuality since neither Greek nor Hebrew has a term for it, really. They have phrases. A man lying with a man as with a woman, for instance. And women going, women are only mentioned once in the whole Bible in terms of same-sex anything. And it's not clear. It's in the New Testament, and it says something about a woman trading the natural for the unnatural. But even those terms, one of the things with biblical languages is, and we've talked about this a little bit before, when you don't understand something, or au contraire, you think you do, but you want to check it out, it's not enough to go to a dictionary, even though I love dictionaries. It's not even enough to go to a concordance. Do you know what a concordance is? Okay. Really, to figure out what the word means, you need to track it down every time it appears and see what's happening every time. And one of the things you learn is Hebrew words, Greek words, like English words, grow over periods of time. So, for instance, the word that is usually translated righteousness or righteous, tzedekah, in Hebrew, comes to mean in a late period something like alms. Because it's an act of righteousness, but it grows from one thing to another. Yeah. So anyway, that's something to be tucked in the back of your mind. The Bible, in one way, is very conversant with sexuality. It doesn't mention it as much as we might think, but it is very comfortable with sexuality, much more so than churches are or synagogues are. And sometimes they're downright blatant about it. So, for instance, in the Hebrew Bible, when a man and a woman have intercourse, it always says he went into her. It's not the tent he's going into; it's her that he's going into. And then there's this next segment is on the Song of Songs, which is, of course, the most erotic book in the Bible. And as we mentioned 2 weeks ago. It had a hard time getting into the canon because it's so erotic. So some rabbis thought it was a baudy collection. fit only to be sung by drunken louts. But Akiba said, if other books are holy, this is the Holy of Holies, and it should be included in the canon. It is, have you ever read it?
No, not the
Apparently
whole
not.
thing. Not the whole thing.
Yes, okay, it's 8 chapters long.
I don't know, maybe. Is it it's Psalms? Is it in Psalms?
No,
No,
it's
yeah,
a whole little book.
yeah.
8 chapters long. It's called either, depending on which Bible you have, the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting historical note. You know, there are traditions about who wrote what books of the Bible, though we know that these people presumably didn't write these things. The rabbis thought that Solomon was responsible for wisdom literature because Solomon is known for his wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
So they said that he wrote the Song of Songs first when he was a lusty youth. He wrote Proverbs when he was a seasoned adult, and he wrote Ecclesiastes, Koheleth, to everything turn, there is a season, but I tried everything, wine, women, and songs, and nothing worked. They said that he wrote that when he was in his dotage and going senile. Well, anyway, the Song of Songs is this remarkable book, which doesn't, one of the other interesting things and one of the reasons why so many people argue that that it shouldn't be included is that God doesn't do anything.
We're laughing at Snitch.
In this, or God is not recorded to have done anything in the Song of Songs. It is pretty much a description of and speeches by lovers. And
Are they named or just?
they're not named, although they talk about the king's son at one point. One of the things that's intriguing about the book, and it has to do with Hebrew grammar, is that on occasion you don't know who's talking. One of the lovers is describing the other lover, and because, in fact, the descriptions are, we would say, a little weird, they're poetic, but they're a little weird, like your teeth are like goats and things like that. But we don't know who's talking. This is all, part of this is in here, but Phyllis Gribble, who is one of my favorite commentators on the Hebrew Bible, wrote an article several years ago, and she wonders if the Song of Songs doesn't describe love, human love, in the way it could be if the fall had never happened. So if there had never been a disruption in the human community, what would pure love look like? And she said it looks like that. In part because every so often you have this Greek chorus, they're not Greek, of course, they're Hebrew, but they're like a Greek chorus of women who comment on what they're seeing in the behavior of the lovers. And there's even, there's admiration for it, but there's also, it's clear that other people sort of have a crush on at least one of the lovers, but the lovers are so besotted with each other that none of that matters. In a sense, it reminds me of first love. When you're first in love, nothing else matters. You know, there can be firecrackers going on under your seat. It doesn't matter. People in church who crinkle candy wrappers, the guy in the little red Maserati who cuts you off in traffic, none of that matters with first love. And that's
Yucky wine.
What?
Yucky wine. Remember you didn't
Oh,
like my
yucky
terrible, the
wine.
wine that I drank. Sorry.
That's right. Yeah, when we were first together, she loved barbecue. I hate barbecue.
You love
And
wimpy lemonade.
I like wimpy lemonade.
Or iced tea or something. I can't
And
remember.
you liked blush wines, which I despise.
It was the... Anyway, it doesn't matter.
But
But
we
those are
weren't
examples of those
having
things.
No,
Right.
everything she did was charming.
That's right.
Everything you did was charming.
That's right. So,
No, I wouldn't go that far.
hey,
Well, as this Song of Song comes down to us, and there are umpteen versions
Yes.
of the Bible, which one would you say was the more accurate?
the most accurate that I know is in a commentary on the Song of Songs, which is 800 pages long.
Oh my God.
By a man whose name, I love his name, is Marvin Pope. And it was published when I was teaching at the seminary. I was very anxious to see this thing. So I quickly got it and took a look at it. And I, in an offhand remark in class one day, I said, this new thing's been published. It's worth a look if you're interested in that book. It's the most graphic I've ever seen. I mean, it really does the Hebrew. It does not shy away. Most English translations back off a little, or a lot. And one woman immediately went to the library, got it out, took it home, and read it to her husband in bed. And he was embarrassed, so left.
Is that graphic?
Is that right?
Wow.
No, it's not illustrated. But it's a very powerful commentary.
Mm-hmm.
One little side footnote. It's in an actual footnote here.
Mm-hmm.
Is that the term Holy of Holies in Hebrew, when you have a noun followed by the word of, followed by the same noun, that's the way they express superlatives. So it can be called the holiest, or the holiest of books, or the songiest. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that is the only whole book that we have that is explicitly about sexual love in the whole Bible. They are, there is, of course, a concern with marriage, but it's not where a lot of people think it is. Genesis 2:3 is not a commandment about what constitutes the norm for marriage. It's a description of something else. It has to do, and we'll get into this in a minute, with propagation. Nor is the fact that Jesus went to a wedding in Cana of Galilee as his first sign in the book of John. That isn't saying that Jesus says this is what has to happen. He never talks about marriage, except he's there and he does the wine thing. But the only side look that we get of marriage is that interesting, and ironically enough, when they talk about divorce. And so that by the first century, it seems that it was normative for a man and a woman to be married. But keep in mind that marriage, as we understand it, was not at all what they understood.
Property.
It has to do with property, and it has to do with the clan. We talked a little about in Ruth this morning about the importance of the clan. I'm going to come back to that, because a lot of the laws, the so-called laws, governing sexual activity have to do with the preservation of the clan or the tribe and property. Because, excuse me, the book of Numbers, among other things, allocates to the 12 tribes of Israel certain portions of the land. And they, not only did they inherit it, sort of, except it's all God's, but they're the caretakers, but they're responsible for it in all kinds of ways, keeping the land pristine, growing things that are appropriate for the land, giving the land a Sabbath. Every 7th year you're supposed to let the land go fallow, because it's much healthier for the land. Now, we know these things now. It's sort of interesting that they lived so close to nature that they knew them instinctively. So there's a lot of that sits behind these texts about who may get together. There are lots of prohibitions about things like incest, and who in the family, I mean, close family relations do not marry. One thing, again, I said this morning with Ruth, that we don't know in the whole biblical record is much about common people. We don't know exactly how they lived. We have snippets, usually from archaeology, but not in the written record, because they didn't write, didn't know how to write or read. So that we hear about the heroes and the heroines, the stories that are handed down, and about kings and queens. But we don't hear about the people who live on the other side of the tracks, or the middle class, what we would call the middle class. So we don't know a lot of normative stuff that applied to them. We're just going on these other stories. I'm going to try and follow along sort of what I'm doing here. So on the third page, we do have some things about exploitation, and it's always men of women. It's never women of men. That sort of perjures. But, so for instance, the famous David and Bathsheba thing, the less famous Pharaoh and Sarah. Do you know what Pharaoh and Sarah?
No.
Right after Abraham and Sarah, who were at that point Avram and Sarai, got the command to leave the land, no sooner do they get to the land, I mean, they leave their hometown to go to this place that God's going to show them, but there's a famine in the land. So they have to leave the land they just got to, and where they go is Egypt, which is, of course, highly ironic given what happens in Exodus. But when they are on the outskirts, Abraham says to her, essentially, listen, I know that when Pharaoh gets a look at you, he's going to want you and maybe kill me. So say you're my sister, and all will go well. And Pharaoh, indeed, does take a liking to Sarah and takes her into his harem. It's kind of interesting, given that they're already just a tad older than I am, and he's worried about Pharaoh falling for him. And then there's Tamar and Absalom. Oh no, the first Tamar is Tamar and Judah. Do you know their story in Genesis 38? Well, we can come back to it if we need to, but essentially it's a father-in-law with a daughter-in-law. And there's a lot of conniving going on there. It's really on her part, but for a good reason, but he does not demur at all. When he sees what he thinks is a prostitute, he goes with her. And then there's the second Tamar with Absalom, their brother and sister, and he essentially rapes her. Now, sometimes people think, well, of course women exploited men. How about Jezebel and Delilah? Except that's in stories and in movies. It's not in the Bible. I mean, those two characters are there, but what they're doing is very different than what is pictured in Hollywood. If you look, this is just a note so you'll recognize my notations. In the middle of, about the third line of the third paragraph, I cite Matthew 19 and Mark 10. When there are two I's in between, that means it's a parallel story. Or it's close to a parallel story. So by the first century, as I've said, we think that it was the norm, at least for the people whom the stories talk about, to be a man and a woman married.
Now, when you say marriage,
Yes.
would this be among the common people as well as those that
Could
we
well
know
be.
about?
Could well be.
So there wouldn't be a difference necessarily.
We don't know enough about, there are dissertations written, a friend of mine wrote one, on trying to get down to what were various practices among common. For instance, to go off the skids for a moment, in Luke, some Jerusalem Jews, I think it's Pharisees on this occasion, take Jesus aside and say, what's with you people who eat incorrectly? There's a system of purification for the food, for the pots and pans, for the dishware, for people. Now, yes, there are laws about all of that. However, if you were wealthy, you could do it. If you were poor, sources of water were harder to find, so we don't actually know how those kinds of things are practiced. It's that kind of thing. So we don't know everything. We know some things about family life, but we don't have enough, scholars don't have enough to accurately and definitely say this is what obtained. Archaeology tells us some things about their houses, about toys for children, but it's because of what we find, actually, that we extrapolate from. But, you know, even with this one man, one woman by the 1st century, we've got all of that polygamy and various concubines littering the landscape for quite a while, and nobody complains about it. I mean, this is normal. So, for instance, and this goes back to the clan and the propagation and stuff, when Sarah is not being very successful in having a child, they promise the child in Genesis 12, nothing's happening. Abraham goes back to God on a couple occasions, 3 occasions, and says, you know, what's with this? And Sarah finally says, I got an idea, and her idea is Hagar, the Egyptian slave. That was apparently accepted practice, that if I couldn't bear a child, we need to have a child, so let's get somebody else in. And of course, there's a very successful movie on Netflix based on a novel that was done about 30 years ago, which is based on that story, The Handmaid's Tale. And of course, Jacob, for instance, he first marries, remember his story? First it's Leah. He wants to marry Rachel, but Laban outfoxes him and sends Leah, who's covered all over, into the tent. He doesn't know until he's consummated the marriage that he's got the wrong girl.
Right.
So then he immediately marries the other one. But that's not enough for him. He has 2 concubines.
He had to work.
In
He had
addition-
to work another 7 years in order
Yeah,
to marry.
He
Rachel.
did, but he got her ahead of time. Yes,
Oh.
that's right. And in a sense, it looks right, because Rachel has terrible time having a baby, just like the matriarchs before her. There's a running joke that you can tell it's a true matriarch if she can't have children, because none of them can. Sarah can't. Rachel implores her husband to implore God about this business of not having children, and Leah pops them out with great regularity. And so did the 2 concubines, but poor Rachel, even though there's an exchange of husbands, it must have been sort of funny. Oh, it's my night. No, it's your night with him. And then the mandrakes, which are supposed to be aphrodisiacs that they give each other. Anyway, so we got a lot of that going on. And as I've said on other occasions, I have difficulty with people saying we really have to live by biblical family values when you look at the Bible.
Yeah.
I don't think I could keep up with it.
Exactly, yeah.
Right.
That nearly
But
got
again,
everything.
there
Sorry.
is no consternation about it. Nobody really it's as if this is normal. And it's because of the propagation. We have to keep reproducing ourselves, and it goes back to Genesis 1, right after the creation of the human community, represented by 2 people. The first command is be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And when they're taken into captivity in Egypt, when they move there, it is said of them that they grew numerous and multiplied and filled the land of Egypt, which sets off that Pharaoh's upset. He starts the whole business about killing the boy babies and letting the girls live, and then super slavery and all that. Anything to stop them multiplying, because if they multiply, I privately think that Pharaoh had too much time on his hands, and he dreamed up scenarios that might happen. So, oh my God, they might get so numerous that they'll take us over. We can't have that. But all of it is to preserve Israel, and to preserve the clans, the families, the clans, the tribes, all of which was to preserve the land. And this will come back and come back and come back. So some of the legislation about sexual activity has at its root the preservation of those units and of the land, above all. Okay. Yeah, the next section is about the various sins, adultery. They were interested in getting rid of adultery, which starts with the Ten Commandments, the so-called Ten Commandments, in both Exodus and Deuteronomy. They were concerned about chastity, though it mainly seems to have to do with girls, with rape. And the interesting thing is that rape in the Hebrew Bible seems to be understood as an act of violence and aggression more than about sex. We tend to think of this as a new thought.
Yeah.
It's an ancient thought. I mean, they gave the death penalty for a rape. And then I just have really, really broad strokes on 3-4, a sketch of the church's attitude about marriage and sex through the centuries. And
Can I ask
this
you a
won't
question?
surprise you. Yes.
Hannah has a question,
Okay.
but I'm not sure. Hannah, you might need to clarify it. You said, wait, why does she say something about the 10 Commandments?
So-called?
Yeah.
Because the Bible doesn't call them the Ten Commandments. The Bible calls them the 10 words.
I knew what you were going to say, but I wasn't going to answer that question. Does that help you, Hannah?
Divrei Asher.
I heard it before. They're called principles.
Well,
What words?
law. Okay, this is an aside, but it's a good question. And Hannah, this is also for you. We call, or sometimes we call, the first 5 books the law, or the whole section following the so-called 10. I also should say, okay, this is a double footnote, that there aren't really 10. There's something more like 14. If you look really carefully, there are a bunch more, and we've collapsed some together. Anyway, there's a whole set of legislation called the Holiness Code, which we'll get to. We have to get to there. And it looks like a lot of little laws. However, as you said, Jeff,
More than just like commands.
They're not-
more
they're not-
principles for living, maybe.
yeah, it's or Torah, which we translate as law, is really guidance pointing, which always means that this is a way. It is a way of life, and we're pointing in that direction. But you know how we in this country and in England, in fact, a lot of countries in the West, how we make laws and change laws. It takes years to do this. Even in the church, we want to change some canon laws. It takes several general conventions and practice and all that stuff. That's great. Except in the Bible, they were constantly rethinking. Does this still apply? Does this make sense for us in this period? Should we shift it slightly? For instance, in Exodus, there is a whole segment of legislation around slavery. We know they practiced slavery right up through the New Testament. It was taken for granted. But there was legislation or pointings about how you acquire slaves and how you treat slaves and about the marriage of slaves and all of that. There's one set in Exodus. When we get to Deuteronomy, which is purportedly a re-recitation of the stuff in Exodus, it's changed. That legislation about slavery has changed because conditions have changed. Yeah. So they didn't have to write it on a ballot with a staple in the left-hand corner and 80 signatures to go through 3 ballots. Their kind of law was not that. It was much more in the principle pointing guidance way of thinking about things. Okay, so anyway, then there's this whole next section on, as I said, broad stroke sketch of the church's attitudes about sex and marriage. And none of this should surprise you. Celibacy looked like the way to go for a while. I mean, the tradition says that Jesus was celibate. Paul talks about celibacy being the better way.
But I always thought it would be wise to model the behavior. And Christ did that with everything.
Yeah, he did.
That's how we got it. So why would he remain celibate? It just, when we keep hearing go and be fruitful,
Right.
or relationships, and
I don't know. That's something I.
Well, there were some
never
questions
said.
about whether he was celibate.
Well, yeah, there are questions about it.
Right.
But that would be a logical fallacy because you never argue, or you shouldn't. You're very careful about arguing from silence. But there's lots of literature. A lot of it's, well, all of it's speculative. And whole movies have been made about, as we know, rather recently, about his marriage to Mary Magdalene, for instance. Excuse me.
Ed, were you asking a question?
No.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, I'm sort of walking through this, but
That's okay.
it is
That's good.
it is highly complex. For a long period of time, sex. I mean, it's interesting because the Hebrew Bible is so open about it. I mean, there's a whole little book aside from Song of Songs. There's a prophetic book, Hosea, where God tells Hosea to get married and to take back a prostitute who fooled around on him. Right? And there's a lot of metaphorical language around sexuality in the Bible. So there's no problem with it in the Hebrew Bible. By the time we get to the church, the skids are on. So we talk about celibacy, and sex is a little suspect. The only reason to have sex is, again, to propagate. There are extremes in their understanding of sex, to the point where one teacher, a father of the church, taught that Mary the Virgin, Mary the mother of Jesus, did not have difficulty with giving birth to the child. No pain at all. And the reason is because she had no enjoyment at the time of conception. So
there's no price to pay then for.
yeah, that's exactly right.
Oh,
And
my
it's
goodness.
like the old joke of, lying there like a board and not participating at all. If you do that, then see, when the baby
Easy.
comes,
Yeah.
it's gonna be much easier.
We could try a
Weird-
study on that.
Weird stuff. There's just really weird stuff about sex in the annals of the church. A celibate clergy comes out of this much later, because as we all know, early in the church, those we now call priests were married. But we call a halt to that, and
Well, even Luther.
well, it's when we get to the reformers, all of that changes.
The
The re-
popes that
Well, yeah,
Yeah,
but
right.
they didn't talk about it much.
Much.
Yeah, the reformers really changed that. I mean, Luther, Cranmer, those people said this is just wrong. And it's around that period where people start thinking about the positive values of sex. Because, in fact, it does forge, in the best ways, it forges a bond between people. And that's good modeling.
and it's good for raising a family.
It's good for raising a family. So there are two schools of thought on this, but it takes a while for all this stuff to develop. I think it's Aquinas. As you might imagine, both Augustine and Aquinas weighed in on this. Yeah, Augustine thought that there were certain values that marriage had, but he still thought sex, even to have children, is a trifle sinful.
A trifle.
Yeah, a trifle.
Trifle pregnant.
But any sex out, just to have fun, that just was condemned.
Was that part of his 180-degree turn? I mean, wasn't he quite
Augustine?
a wild one as a
Yes,
young man?
Augustine
Yes.
was
Yeah.
quite profligate
Right.
as a young man. Had many lovers.
Mhm.
In fact, his mother, Monica, was desperate to have him become a Christian. He wasn't for a long time. And the reason he put it off is he knew he was going to have to change his behaviors,
Mm.
according to his own
There's that
confessions.
one about make me good but not
Not
yet.
yet.
Or something.
Right,
Yeah, right.
Right.
And then he went
Put it on.
And then he went in the other
along,
direction.
by far,
Well, yeah.
too far
We were talking
My-
about this morning. It's like
version.
people who change some behavior and then become radical.
Fanatic.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. he reminds me of that in a certain way. Then we come to the question of homosexuality, which is even more complex than sex itself, other heterosexual sex. And here's the date. OED 1892 is the first time that we know of it in English.
Talk a little bit about David and Jonathan.
David and Jonathan and Ruth and Naomi.
Okay.
Yeah, people have noticed that the affection between David and Jonathan was of an intimate nature, that they are described as being extraordinarily close. You are better to me than many women. But this is one of those places. The Bible, in all of its narratives, tends to be what one literary critic calls, oh God, what does he call it? Well, he's talking about, what he's describing is a kind of restraint. We're told a story, and we're trotting along with the story, and suddenly the curtain falls, and we don't know what happened. So, for instance, in the story about, this is all about Jonathan, David, and Ruth and Naomi, I promise. But it's easier to describe with another story. When Abraham and Sarah finally have a child, after 25 years and several chapters, and he's now 100 by the time they have the kid, and she's in her 90s. And within the next couple of chapters, God out of nowhere says to Abraham one day, Abraham, take your son, your only one, the one with whom you are one, whom you love, and offer him up on one of the upping places that I'll show you. Now, and then it said, the next thing is, and early in the morning, Abraham got up and saddled his he-ass, and he got the firewood, and he got the knife. The knife is, it's not the regular word for knife, it's a knife that's bloodthirsty. It's an eating knife. It's the choice of words in that story is incredible. Anyway, what we wonder is, what is he thinking? I mean, what is God thinking on one hand, but what is Abraham thinking? He's been waiting for this only child forever. He had another kid with Hagar, but as far as he knows, that kid is dead. The chapter before, Hagar and Ishmael are banished to the wilderness where everybody dies. So as far as he knows, all he's got is Isaac, and God's saying, I want it. Offer him up. So we're chugging along with this story, we're horrified, and then we get no indication of what Abraham's thinking. He just sets about the task. That's what the guy who noticed this was a man named Auerbach. Oh, it's deep background and deep foreground. And he contrasts both the New Testament, but especially the Hebrew Bible, with Greek and Roman mythology, where everything's on the surface. I mean, when somebody thinks something, you know what they're thinking. There's a segment in the Odyssey when Odysseus comes home, and he doesn't want anybody to recognize him. Remember, his wife Penelope has all these visitors and suitors. Yes, he doesn't want anybody to know who he is. He wants to get a sense of the lay of land. And the first person he meets when he gets there is his old wet nurse. So she knows him intimately from when he was a child. And she remembers that he has a scar on his leg. Being that she is a very hospitable woman, when she sees him, she invites him in and immediately sets about washing his feet. He knows that when she gets up to this scar, she's going to recognize him. So Homer tells us how she's washing in the water and all that business, and then as her hand gets closer, suddenly he takes us back to the memory that Odysseus has of when he was 5 years old or something, and went hunting for boars with his grandfather, and this boar. So this goes on for pages. It's all of what he's thinking before she actually does this. Hebrew never does that. It will tell you a story to a certain point, and then it stops. With Jonathan and David, we never go further. We don't know what their intimacy was. Was it sexualized? Was it not? We don't know. The language between Naomi and Ruth we use for weddings. I mean, Ruth, even until death do us part, we get that from Ruth chapter 1. And yet this is a conversation between, well, it's really a monologue of one woman to another. And at the end of the book, the Greek chorus there says to Naomi of Ruth, she is more to you than 7 sons. So again, I don't know. I mean, in one way, it's really an interesting kind of intimacy, and it clearly is. The language is very intimate. Relationship between an older woman, a mother-in-law, and a daughter-in-law. One Israelite, one foreign. I mean, but they never go any further. We don't know. I have no idea what's happening there.
Is it because it isn't considered important that we know that?
It may be. It also does a thing which I love, which is presses me to get closer and closer and closer and closer to that text to see what I make of it. And the rabbi said that the charge for us to interpret the Bible comes from the story of Jacob wrestling with that angel. That what we're supposed to be doing all the time is asking questions of the text. And the rabbis believed that a lot of interpretation takes place in those white spaces between the words.
Are we to keep the interpretation to ourselves, or are we to...
No, what we're supposed to be doing is this.
Sharing.
Always doing it in community. It's when we don't do it in community. If I go off by myself, I am well capable of going, way offline. And part of it is, and we've talked about this before, that each of us brings to the study, to any interpretation of the newspaper, of one another, of a movie, everything that's in our past. So certain words will set me off because of something that happened a long time ago that indelibly marked me. But if I'm with you and you don't have that history, you can help set me straight. That's, very glibly said, but it is true. So the same thing happens with the Bible. And we get ourselves into serious trouble when one person goes off and says, this is the truth. This is what this thing means. And it doesn't mean anything else. No, the Bible's always very polyvalent. Now, what I'm about to do here is run through the famous passages which have been used for years against homosexual behavior.
And I understand that so often, and you talked about it early on, they'll pull out a passage, but you won't know what came before, and you won't know what came after. They just use a little section to settle the plate.
And what I'm going to say at the outset, it is in here, but it bears repeating, is that my take on these texts, and my take is shared by a lot of scholars, I didn't pull this out of the air, is absolutely opposed by others who also studied the text, also know Hebrew and Greek, also know this thing. Again, it's partially because it's not as explicit as it seems to be. So, for instance, there are the two most famous passages in the Hebrew Bible come from the book of Leviticus. Well, no, before that, some that hardly anybody talks about anymore, although some people do. is the passage of Adam and Eve. So that's about marriage. It's really not about marriage. And that means that only a man and woman can be married. A friend of mine said, well, we just spelled the name of one of them wrong. It's Adam and Y-V-E-S. Adam and Eve. I love that. But that's not about marriage. That story is about other things. Similarly, as I've said before, the wedding at Cana is not Jesus saying, this is how you ought to marry. This is a story about his sign, his first public act as himself. It's the first thing he does. And then the other story that they pull out, that's double story, is Sodom and Gomorrah, from which we get the word sodomite, as a matter of fact. And then there's a kind of a parallel in Judges 19. But both of those stories have to do with hospitality. It's not about homosexuality. And most people, including people on the other side of this issue, have dismissed those now. They do understand that these stories are about other things. So then we go to the ones that seem.
Do you think fundamentalists do? Extreme
I said some.
I know, that's what I'm asking.
No, extreme. No. We know.
We know the ones.
But,
Yeah.
yeah, and they can read it that way. I mean, see, interpretation, because it's not saying this is a story about hospitality. Our understanding is that's what it's about. But other people can read it and say, no, it's not. The real thing is about these guys want to have sex with this guy.
And that's why the argument about inerrancy cannot even exist.
Well, there's the whole thing. I mean, when we look at Leviticus, which I actually gave you all the quotations here. You, masculine singular, shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It's an abomination. And then 2013 sort of repeats it. If a man or when a man lies with a male, as one lies with a woman, an abomination, both of them done, they are to be put to death deathly. Their blood is upon them. Now,
Can I ask a question for Hannah again?
yes.
She said that she's heard the Greek translation says, wait a minute, man shall not lie with boy instead of man shall not lie with
Okay.
man. Is that true?
Is she talking about Romans or is she talking about Leviticus?
Hannah, are you talking about Romans or Leviticus, or are you sure?
Because we haven't gotten to the New Testament yet, and there is a thing in the New Testament about a boy.
We'll see if she answers in a second. Keep
Okay.
going. Hannah, sorry, lots of questions.
Okay, that's fine. We'll make sure that she gets a copy of this because it's in Nuce.
Okay.
All right, a couple of things here. One is, I mean, they grasp onto the word abomination. The problem is the word abomination is used for lots of things, including how you wear your clothes and whether you mix certain kinds of food. So that's a problem. Second thing is that we're in the middle of a section, and this is what you were talking about before. You got to look around. So where is this passage? Well, it's in a segment of Leviticus, everybody's favorite book.
Are you
Which-
being facetious?
Now, yes, I am reading that piece. Thank you. That is about holiness. That's why it's called Holiness Code. And it's based on a thing that's repeated time and time again, wherein God is said to have said, be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. So you're supposed to be like me, which makes sense. That's a message of the whole Bible, as a matter of fact. We're supposed to be emulating that kind of behavior. The word kadosh, 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 is holy, holy, holy. Kadosh is the verbal form. And at its root, it means to separate. To be separated to and to be separated from. Israel is God's precious possession. And God at Sinai, it even says, I am a jealous God. And I want to preserve you as my people. Now this will change over time because they begin to understand that it's not just Israel, it's the whole world that God is interested in. But at this period, we're talking about a concern for not getting confused about things by doing what other people in the neighborhood do. So if you go to dinner, to be stupid about this, if you go to dinner with the Canaanites have different ways of eating and drinking, and I don't want you to get into those habits. So I want, you are holy to me, you are separate to me, you're separate from them. So anything that these other people are doing, I don't want you to be doing. We don't know everything about the cultures that surround them, but we do know that in fact there were cults in which sexual activity took place to spur certain things on. There was, and we know this to be true, and this will show up again in the New Testament, there was a practice of invading forces, the victors, humiliating the captors by forcing heterosexuals into homosexual activities. And it was usually the aggressor who took the male role, forcing the oppressed people to take the female role. And in a society that was all about shame, this was odious. So these, on the surface of it, on the one hand, people can say, well, it's very clear there, that's what it says. On the other hand, there's all this other stuff, which is saying it's really about what other people who are not us do. It's about shaming people.
And history.
And history, yeah. Like right.
Yeah, I read something just today. It was real interesting, and it was about the Sodom and Gomorrah story, and it emphasized the fact that the guests were foreigners. And so the townspeople, the males, basically wanted them to send the men out. They were going to rape them and humiliate them. They were foreigners. What I find interesting is that there's not been outrage over the fact that the daughters were offered up as a subject.
And the concept,
Take my daughters and rape them.
And in Judges 19, she is raped so badly that she's dead in the morning.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
these are terribly violent.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. But again, because sex made a turn at some point from it's perfectly normal, we all do it, to oh no, it can be sinful, and so the sex stuff in the Bible gets hyped.
But why was the male sex stuff demonized and hyped, and the fact that the women could just be taken and raped, that wasn't a problem?
I think because women were
Well, I understand that within that context, but I'm talking about our response now. I never hear a fundamentalist talking about how, their daughters are going to be raped. Never. It's always about sodomites, which is a misinterpretation anyway. But
Right. Yeah, you're right. And I'm sorry I don't.
Well, it's just it's an interesting twist in how people are still interpreting or misinterpreting, and not being outraged by that, and the fact that that was just out of hand.
There is also I'll come right to you. There's also the sacrifice. I mean, Isaac is not sacrificed in the story as we have it now. He eventually grows up. He gets married, has children. He's kind of a dud. Isaac is. I think of Isaac as Christmas when I was a kid. I look forward to it, and then the day happened and it was over in 10 minutes. Yeah, right. Sort of duddy. Isaac's like that. He really doesn't do anything except have kids, and then he's fooled by his own kids. I lost my train of thought there.
Wendy, what was your question?
I was just thinking that I liken the concern with homosexuality, and I think recognizing it for what it is so new to the general public that in 20 years, 40 years, there won't be a question. There won't be any real discussion because life just goes on and
if this is right, if we ought to pay attention to the surrounding cultures and what's taking place and shame, there is no conception of two consulting adults consenting, that's consulting, consenting adults. That's not what any of this is about.
Right.
So their understanding of a man lying with a man or a woman against nature is very different from our own understanding of what's going on here. And we do a lot of that, expecting that these ancient texts really do mirror, in a certain sense, our lives in the 21st century. In a lot of ways they do. That's when I was talking a couple of weeks ago about truth. It's really true. This stuff always happens, and it's always been happening. And on the other hand, it's really, we got to understand it's really different from us. We have to peel back layers to figure out what's going here. And we could be peeling the wrong layers. We always, did I say it to you or somebody else? It's Tribble again. Years ago, did a remarkable job doing an interpretation of Genesis 22, the Isaac Abraham story. And she said, at the very end of it, she said, even though I have spent a long time studying and studying and studying this story, and this is my true interpretation now, it may be that when I meet God, God will say, absolutely wrong. And God will say to me, take your interpretation, your only interpretation, which you love, and take it on up to one of the mountains that I will show you. And I think that I always keep that in mind, which is also why, to put a side note here, I always say to people, if anybody, including I, ever says to you, this is what this story means, go running for the hills, because even though the Bible is ancient, it's like it keeps changing. It's not changing, I'm changing. And my circumstances are changing.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Did you know that new Bible that you got, that A.J. Levine or
Yes.
And what was the other person's name?
Doug Knight?
Doesn't matter. Did you look in that at all through any of these texts?
I did not.
I'd just be curious to know what they do with it because of their very different
Is that
perspectives.
that new translation that goes?
No, it's not a translation. It's a what does the Bible mean or say or
Oh,
something.
okay.
So it's got somebody who's more of an evangelical fundamentalist. Is he more evangelical or fundamentalist?
Who, Doug?
Yeah.
No.
Oh, I thought he had a very different perspective than A.J.
No. They would be. Doug was my advisor.
Oh, then that's not the book I'm thinking of. Okay. I'll come back to that later. I'm talking about that new Testament that you got recently.
It's the commentary on Luke.
Oh, commentary on
Yes.
Luke. Sorry.
I wouldn't have
Never
checked
mind
it
then.
because
Yeah,
there's
not in
nothing
there.
in Luke.
All right.
I didn't remember what all it was
Of course,
for.
there's the other thing that Jesus never ever talks about this.
Okay.
It's a non-issue for him. No, that other commentary is really interesting because it is two scholars, well-trained scholars, but one is evangelical and the other is
Yeah,
liberal.
you referred to that at
Yes,
an
I've
earlier.
shown
Yes,
it.
yes,
I couldn't
right,
remember what all
right,
it covered,
right.
so
I
never mind.
used it
We're just
for
curious.
the infancy narratives.
Okay.
No, it doesn't cover any of this.
Okay.
One last thing.
Because that would have been interesting.
In the Hebrew Bible,
Yes.
people who were, quote, married, was that mostly by arrangement?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there are lots of differences between what we understand marriage to be and what they understood it to be. It tended to be arranged, and again, for the sake of the clan and the family, or for alliances. Not unlike Europe.
I was thinking, like royalty, European royalty, there's always alliance.
Right. Yeah. So, for instance, when Isaac does grow up, and they've just buried Sarah, he wants Isaac to get married because she has to have children, and he sends his servant back to where they came from so that it's kept in the clan. You can't just marry anybody.
Yeah.
And when well, anyway, there are other stories about this, about arranging these things. The last thing I want to say about this Leviticus thing is these law codes, so-called law codes, come from the same period in which Genesis 1 is written. And that period is the exile, when Israel was really threatened to be completely wiped out. So if there's ever a period in which you really have to pay attention to getting children, multiplying, filling the earth, this is the period.
Mhm.
So it's no accident that we have laws like these two, because the other thing is you're wasting seed, and you can't be wasting seed.
Right.
If you're going to have babies, you can't waste seed. To the story of Tamar and Judah that I referred to before, one of the kids in this arrangement wastes the seed and he gets killed for it.
There's Onan.
Onan.
Yes, we get the word onanism from his action.
Right.
So Hannah says she thinks it was the. So for
Romans?
those who might not know, that might have come in. Hannah's on here through Facebook. She thinks it was the Leviticus one. She and somebody else. You have lots of people kind of watching you at the moment, in case you want to say hi to anybody. But
I did look at both of these in Hebrew. The word is male, Zachar, Ish and Zachar. Ish is a man, Zachar is the male,
okay.
or the word that means male. Later in Romans, there is concern because one seems to be a boy.
So that may be the one she's actually thinking of. Okay.
There are a couple here from from pastoral epistles, from the Pauline canon, and two in Jude and 2 Peter. The Jude and 2 Peter are a rehash of the Gomorrah story, so we're not even going to go there. The others, the ones from Paul, there's one from Romans and one from 1 Corinthians. Now, Romans, I think it helps to know that Romans is the one letter that he wrote to a community that he didn't found and where he'd never been. The letter seems to have been his kind of introduction. I'm coming, and greetings to you. But he doesn't know the specifics. So far as we know, he doesn't know a lot of specifics about this community. He does know, we think, some things in general that are already going wrong there. There was, in fact, a kind of a schism between the early part of the Roman Christian community, which was Jewish, so Jewish Christians. But then Rome outlawed the Jewish community, and so the Gentile Christians came in and took over. But then when Rome changed the law and let the Jews be legal again, the Jews came back, and there was a fight about who's real here. You guys who stayed or you guys who left. He may well have known about that. We're not sure. But Romans is a more general. He's introducing himself and his thoughts about what Christianity should be, so that when he lists these things, he tends to list things. So we have natural relations and unnatural relations and passion and men committing shameless acts with men and all that business. This particular part is not that that's what they're doing. This is that God, angry with all kinds of actions. In the segment right about this, God is upset with all kinds of general sin, and God's punishment is this. That people who were ordinarily heterosexual are forced into this. So again, that's the part that's unnatural. Now again, people on the other side could say, no, that's not what it means. It means that these people, that's their sin. people on my side say, no, if you look at the thing that comes before it, this seems to be the action of God against people. And then we get into women, and as I said before, there's no mention of women to women sexual activity anywhere else in the entire Bible. So the question is this about women lying with women, or is it about women using devices? Like dildos, ancient dildos.
Well, he wasn't especially fond of women anyway.
Well, there's the thing. He was. Okay.
Except you've changed your views about Paul and
I
women.
have changed my views because I've learned more about
Right.
Paul.
No, I just wanted to point that out.
Yes.
Just
There's
saying.
a great book, I think it's Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, who have written something on Paul, authentic Paul. Now, people have known about it before, but they made it crystal clear, at least to me. There's a difference between there are 3 layers in the Pauline corpus. There's authentic Paul, who wrote 7 epistles. Then there's secondary Paul, who's not really Paul. They're followers of Paul. Maybe they knew him. Maybe they just liked his teachings. But it's another generation. Paul presumably is gone. And the church is getting more and more solidified, and things are changing. So this secondary bunch actually disagrees with some of the things in primary Paul. And then there's the third bunch, and Timothy's one of the third bunch, who are, if you look at Paul on women, it's really clear if you look at 2 things, Paul on women and Paul on slavery. The authentic Paul has lots of women disciples. He even claims that his chief teacher was a woman. And he always, we think that sometimes he sent these letters, because remember, an epistle is a letter to a bunch of people. It's okay. The person, because he wasn't going, that's why he sent the letter, so it would have gone with someone who not only could read, but could interpret Paul, so that people would have questions. What does he mean about this? That person would have to know not just the content of the letter, but what Paul was driving at. Some of those people appear to have been women. And he always salutes women in these various places. Secondary and tertiary Paul, however, do not. So this is where you get all the stuff of women be silent in the churches, and women cover your heads, and the Christ is the head of the church, and men are like Christ, and women are, all that. Comes at a different point. And in part, that may have to do also with surrounding culture. So if you think Jesus is coming back soon, and you want to get converts to your movement, you don't want to cause scandal. And some of what women in surrounding society was doing was causing scandal for some people. So you want to divorce yourself from that behavior. That's just really the top of that iceberg.
Have you ever heard of the book The Amnesty of Grace?
No.
It's by Elsa, I don't know how to say Elsa's last name, Tamez. Stacey Allen said that she fell in love with Paul through that book.
Tammuz. Okay, no. Stacey Allen's on too? Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Hope you all don't mind that I'm asking a couple questions for some other... She didn't ask a question, she just made a statement. I thought,
I have not, but I will.
Thank
look
you,
at
Stacey.
that. Okay. On the other hand, what's the matter?
Says, I like to call the pastoral epistles Pauline fan fiction. Did you guys know Stacey Allen? She's a chaplain down at Burnt House at University of Chicago. She's great.
Yeah,
Yeah,
she's
that's
been
great.
to St. John's.
Well, and
Yeah, she has been to St. John's. Yeah, you've been to St. John's, haven't you, Stacey?
and the other thing is one Pauline scholar has said that Paul would roll over in his grave if he had any idea that what he wrote on the equivalent of a first century envelope is now being proclaimed as gospel in the churches.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah. Well, and I've said this before, but sometimes when we proclaim these things in church, I mean, it would help if we all remember that we're reading somebody else's mail.
Yeah, right.
And the situations to which Paul directed himself in the communities that he knew well, like Corinthians. Corinthians was one that he founded and he knew well. There's specific problems in those communities, which the community of St. John may not have that problem. So it doesn't, sometimes it just doesn't fit. It seems a little awkward. I mean, sometimes it does fit, but sometimes because he's talking about a particular thing, like for instance in Corinth, they were doing the Eucharist wrong. It was classism and stuff. And he goes on, and in fact, if we only had the epistles, if we had no Gospels, we only had the epistles, we would not know this about the centrality of the Eucharist, because Paul doesn't spend any time on it except when people are doing it wrong.
Interesting.
Yes, that's one of the things I always like to ask people when we're studying the Bible is, and I believe I'm repeating myself, but if we didn't have this particular book, pick any book, if we didn't have that book, how would our faith be different? Because it would be. But how about if this is the only book we had? If we had none of the rest of it, what would we think? And what would we believe? And how would we act? I mean, John the Evangelist, okay. So if we didn't have the Gospel of John, among other things, among a whole raft of things, we wouldn't have those crosses with Jesus triumphant, in priest clothes and all that. That's John's Jesus. That is not Matthew, Mark, and Luke's Jesus, who's a very different character. Well, that was a little excursus.
I was going to say, was that a sidebar or a
Yeah.
footnote?
That was an excursus. Then you get into 1 Corinthians. He does know this congregation. He's been to them. This is not as general as the epistle to the Romans. So he's writing about specific things. But again, he goes into one of these lists. And he seems to be talking again about behavior of outsiders. Once you're baptized, and remember, we're trying to get people in, then you don't do these specific things. Now, some of them are technically sins, because he's talking about things like idolaters and adulterers and prostitutes and the greedy drunkards and revilers. But then when he gets into male prostitutes and sodomites, we're in a problem again. On the one hand, you can look at this and say, well, that's what it says. So obviously that's a sin just like all these other things. But the problem is the two Greek words, which they can't mean homosexuals because the word didn't exist yet. Sodomites, of course, did. But these two words, even if you look at them every time they appear in the Bible, it's a little slippery slope. And this is one of the places where it can refer to an aggressor, older man taking a boy and imposing his will on him, in which case the boy, who is a boy, so an inferior, is acting like a girl. So it's shame again. So once again, it can be this way, but if you think about what the Greek words mean, it can be going the other direction. It can be about shame. And in a culture of shame, where shame was really important, we can see something
Think
else.
about the time up to the crucifixion. All that they did to Christ was just to increase the shame and to demean him.
Yeah.
Everything that was done was just unbelievably cruel in that. It just seems like the whole society just wanted to
Well, and you can see why,
clobber.
with that in mind, again, this is another excursus, why the disciples went away. I mean, because this was a shameful thing. This guy that they thought this was the guy, and now he's not doing anything to argue his case. He's been branded as the worst of the worst. He's being degraded publicly. I mean, there's on the one hand the fear that this may rub off on them because they're his associates, but on the other hand, it is shameful, right?
And how could he allow that to happen?
Including one of my favorite characters. He's not named, and he only appears in one gospel. In the beginning of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, at least, when he calls the disciples, and then they leave everything to follow him. And in Mark, it's immediately they immediately drop their nets and go. So they leave everything to follow him. When he's arrested, they all leave him, and this one disciple leaves everything. He has his clothes on, and he loses his clothes. He runs from the Romans, and they almost catch him. When I was teaching high school, high school kids don't want to read the Bible. So I would say to the kids, when we're on Mark, look for the naked guy. You can stop reading when you get to the naked guy, and of course the naked guy is right at the end.
Smart teacher.
Talk a little bit more about the culture of shame and how it played such an important role then and what we think of it now.
I think our culture is not built as solidly on issues of shame as blatantly. I think it's here, obviously, but you don't think about it every waking hour, or I don't.
And I like to think too that as we look at various denominations, the Episcopal Church doesn't deal with it as much as some of the other denominations do. Like I'm always telling my best friend that we're just like the Roman Catholics, except we don't deal with guilt the way they do. I said you could have a much easier life if you'd come with us, because you don't have to deal with that. And I just firmly believe that with what they say and what they do, and they get so wrapped up in like the different kinds of sin. Well, is this a mortal or is this a venal, or and how often you should go to confession. And someone said in here at the first time that I think it was Ellen had to think of some things to confess when she went to confession.
I did too.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, what should I confess? What can I?
But the culture of shame was just important to the Israelites as it was to all the other cultures around them.
Yes, and it shows up in stories as again the thing underneath the story.
Well, even in Islam, there's a very strong thread of the shame, particularly with dealing with women and issues of adultery and rape and everything.
Because it brings shame on the whole family, so that has to be taken away. Right.
I think we still very much deal with the culture of shame, especially outside of the church. I mean, I'm just thinking of the many people who won't, especially when you're talking about sexuality issues here, people outside our doors, not just the Episcopal Church, but other faiths, who would not dare step in because of the way in which their understanding of what the church has to say about them. And it makes the shame part be, I think, pretty serious for folks. Thus, some of the issues that we have around suicide. It's large within the LGBTQ community, huge. And I think shame is part of that. We still give the message of shame. And I wonder how we as a church are better about articulating that that's not the life in which we live.
I think that's right.
Thank you.
And we're also talking about just one portion of the Anglican Church.
Right, that's right.
Because if we're in perhaps Nigeria
Correct.
Or Uganda, we might be stoned to death.
Yes,
That's right.
Yeah.
Although there's been a lot of conversation. Are we hearing something?
That was my hearing.
Oh, okay, mine does that too. I thought maybe it was mine. There have been some conversations, some groups that have gone back and forth in parts of Africa, and some of our friends have been part of this conversation, where part of what they're discovering within the Anglican tradition is there's a bunch of the times that it's actually the bishops that sit in that position and not the people. And so when they're there having one-on-one conversations and telling stories, they're learning a lot more about how it's not completely cultural, but some of it is the bishops as well. I mean, it's still cultural, but
Right.
they've been
there's very
stunned
cultural.
to find how much it still, stun's the wrong word, but somewhat surprised at how much the bishops are the one that are really standing in the way in those places in terms of opening up.
Well, we are not immune to it in this country.
No, we're
in
not.
this church either, as we've seen very recently.
Yes, we are. We're watching it play out right now with a few dioceses. So,
Right.
yeah.
So you're right. I think it's just, I think it's not as big as this, but you know how people talk about, some people talk about, we've solved the problem of racism in this country. And what we've done, on the one hand, it's gone back underground again because it was not socially acceptable. But now that it is socially acceptable, it's coming out again. And I think it surprises a lot of people how fierce and blatant it has been. So maybe shame is a little bit like that. It was like a headline for the ancients, and I don't think that's quite where it is now for us. It's not in huge blazing letters that from the very earliest age you know that you're living in a society which is controlled entirely by shame and honor.
So I know that from your perspective as a biblical scholar, you've given us kind of your interpretation, but I certainly know some other biblical scholars that we also respect who still believe that some of those texts actually are saying that homosexuality is wrong. I mean, I know AJ, when I was with her at a conference very specifically, and I don't remember which text she's still named as, I think this actually does say that, and that's troubling. Then you go with the time and how cultural it's different, but I just remember that. Are there any in there, when you read them, you think, well, maybe it is about that?
The last one.
Did you say that in your form and I haven't looked at it yet?
Yeah, it's here.
Okay, sorry.
It's in 1 Timothy, and again,
Thank you, sorry.
It's a list.
Oh, yes.
And again, we're faced with the meaning of the words fornicators and sodomites, but so that one could be, of all of them, it's the strongest one for saying, yeah, this is sinful behavior. Some commentators, however, understand fornicators, sodomites, and slave traders to be a unit, so that, again, it's an aggressor against a youth, a slave, and the slave trader who's put them there. That's a block of people. So on the one hand, it could be yet again a concern about what these words really mean, and is this a unit? In which case, we're talking about at least one who is heterosexual and against his own inclinations is being forced to do something which is for him not natural. The other partner may or may not find it a natural thing, but the slave trader is the one who's given those two opportunities. That's one reading. Or it could be, yes, by this time. But in 1 Timothy, we're in the 2nd century. We're pretty far removed from the time of even Paul, when things have begun to solidify. Church structures are more solidified and settled, so that now we're talking more about categories of sin than we were before. So this one, for me, is the closest one to a condemnation.
And of course, Timothy, we don't even know.
No, we don't know who it is. He could have been a follower of Paul's. He could have been someone who admired him, and so took up some of what Paul would have said. But on the other hand, he's in some ways distant from authentic first level Paul. Yes.
And how much of this had to do with the adoption or the continuation of that notion of separateness that the Hebrew people adhered to?
Yeah.
How much of it then went into the early church? I mean, it seems to me like there's an awful lot of it. And then they were preaching to Greeks, Corinth, all over the place, to a culture where, it was fairly well accepted
Right.
to have those relationships.
Hellenistic.
But yet there was a shameful aspect because it was okay, for boys and young men, but once the young man got to a certain age, if you continued it, it was shameful.
That's right.
He should go have a wife or whatever.
Yeah.
So, but this notion of being separate and all that, and maintaining that.
Well, as a it's an infant organization. It's just beginning to sprout its wings,
Mm-hmm.
and you have to know who you are and what you believe. I mean, the fact that the formation of the canon is beginning at this period. Who are we? What do we believe? So there's a way in which we have to be separate. I mean, for Israel, in all the business about the clans, and particularly in the exile, who are we? So this is the period when you get the laws of kosher and circumcision. It says we're different. We know, and we know each other. We have the secret handshake, in a certain sense. So I think that does play into this.
Which is kind of like the application of purity laws, but in terms of human behavior, in a way.
Okay, that's my wad on.
Okay.
Say goodbye to your fans.
And as you will notice, I mean, in 2003, I was at that general convention when Gene Robinson was okayed to be a bishop by general convention.
And vilified.
And vilified. Yeah, it was an unreal
Oh, God, it
convention.
was awful.
But before the convention, the parish in which I was serving, I was in charge of all the formation of everybody. And I said to the adults, we really need to talk about convention, because I think that it would behoove you to know what convention is and how we do things and what are the major things that are coming up. No, we don't need to know. We trust you. You go off and do this thing. I come home they are, beside themselves. And as soon as I arrived, they said, we have to talk about Leviticus. And I said, you are not ready for Leviticus. But the point is that, everybody got hot under the collar about homosexuality, so they want to talk about that. No, you have to talk about all of sexuality in the Bible. This is one aspect. It's not, you don't just, it's like pulling things out of the text. So we pull this stuff out. Yeah, right. Anyway.
Thank you, Vicki.
Bye.